Howdy, Flip Science, we're looking at speciation and evolution. Thanks to Sam Moyle for producing this PowerPoint. So science understandings we're going to look at. Speciation may result from an accumulation of genetic changes influenced by different selection pressures or genetic drift in geographically isolated populations. Describe the process of speciation due to physical separation, allopatric speciation, and compare allopatric and sympatric speciation. Similar selection pressures on unrelated species may lead to convergent evolution. Recognize and give examples of convergent evolution. When new niches become available to a species, for example as a result of succession or following an environmental change, different selection pressures may lead to divergent evolution and adaptive radiation. Recognize and give examples of adaptive radiation. So species, how do you become a species? We've defined a species as a group of organisms that are more or less alike and can produce fertile offspring in their natural environment. Remember, this definition applies to sexually reproducing species. Development of a new species is a process that occurs slowly, it's almost unnoticed. Natural selection alters the characteristics of a population over many generations. The extreme result of this process is the evolution of two or more species from one, and we refer to that as speciation. So how does speciation happen? Initially, you have a single population that's split into groups, and the ways that those groups can be split up are things like geographical isolation or changes to the environmental conditions. Over thousands of years, the selection pressures drive the increase in different gene frequencies in the gene pool, and that drives the evolution of the species. This assumes that there's no gene flow between the groups, because if we keep on having exchange, then the gene pool will stay basically the same. So let's look at an example of where speciation has happened. So we'll talk about the Galapagos Islands. It's a volcanic oceanic region in the South Pacific. It might have been a singular landmass for a while due to low sea levels from previous ice ages. But with the rise in sea levels and continental drift, it's broken up into little islands. And because we have islands now, that's prevented gene flow between populations of those islands. Each island is slightly different, so they each have slightly different environments, and that has forced the evolution of the animals present, including finches. So here we have different finches that are on different islands of the Galapagos, so we can see how their beaks have adapted to exploit different food sources. So this one feeds on insects and nectar, whereas this one feeds on seed. So we can see we have different beak shapes because of the different food sources that the birds are exploiting. Over time, the finches are so different from each other that they can't interbreed anymore, and that means they're their own defined species. So we might have had an original finch species that was populating the landmass that made up the Galapagos. As the Galapagos turned into islands, then we have different selection pressures on each different islands, different food sources, and that's driven natural selection of the birds that are remaining on those islands, to the point where now they have enough genes that are different from each other that they wouldn't be able to interbreed if they were introduced to each other again. Darwin's finches are an example of adaptive radiation. We're going to talk about what adaptive radiation is later on. But the idea is we have an ancestral finch. On different islands we have different conditions and different food sources for those finches. So you get selection pressures on the finches to exploit those food sources. So you get mutations that make your beak slightly better at catching insects, and that gets carried on through generations, which leads to you having a beak of this shape, for example. So by using different food sources and even tools over here, we get different beak shapes, which allow the different bird species to exploit different food sources. And that's produced through natural selection. Let's talk about allopatric speciation. The process of forming a new species by geographic isolation is called allopatric speciation. Allopatric means different place. Geographical isolation alone can't drive evolution. There needs to be enough time for conditions to change on either side of the geographical barrier, and that leads to different selection pressures being present on either side of the geographical barrier, which will eventually lead to selective pressures acting on the genes present in the population to the point where the gene pool changes enough so that reproductive isolation occurs. Here we have our original population, we have a geographic barrier. So what could be a geographic barrier that pops up? So a geographic barrier could be something like a mountain. It could be something like a river or a lake. Remember, we're talking about these things happening over long periods of time. So we get a geographic barrier, we get different conditions on either side of the geographic barrier, which leads to reproductive isolation due to selection pressures present on either side of the geographic barrier. And then once you get enough changes in the gene pool, we get reproductive isolation occurring, and that leads to speciation. Sympatric speciation is different, so it refers to the evolution of two species that are living in the same geographical area. Sympatric means same place, so allo is different, sym means same. So sympatric speciation is difficult to distinguish, and it's more common amongst things like plants and bacteria, where you might have very, very subtle differences in conditions present in the same place. So we're not looking at huge geographic barriers, we're looking at subtle differences in things like, for plants, soil geology. In plants, it can occur as a result of polyploidy or hybridisation. Sympatric speciation happens within a geographic area. So let's talk about polyploidy for a second. So it results from an organism having more than 2 sets of chromosomes. This can occur if chromosomes don't separate after duplication in mitosis, and that can produce a fertile individual as it will still have homologous chromosomes that can pair during meiosis. A new sexually reproducing plant species can be formed this way. The polyploid cell can also reproduce asexually, which is good fun. So here we have our parent cell, so our diploid number is 6. We get a meiotic error where we get unreduced gametes. So what that means is that rather than having we should be going down to a haploid number of 3, our haploid number is still 6. So now when we get fertilization occurring, we have rather than a diploid number, we have a tetraploid number, so it's got 12. So it's got 12 chromosomes here. This could still be a viable plant that will survive and be able to have offspring. Hybridization results from the fusion of 2 cells of 2 different species that gives rise to an organism that has chromosomes from both species. If this occurs in animals, the offspring is often sterile, so we haven't made a new species, we've just made infertile offspring. The chromosomes of the hybrid, like a mule, they're not homologous and therefore they can't pair during meiosis. But in plants, they might be able to reproduce asexually. So let's look at an example in plants again. So we've got cells from species A and species B. We digest away the cell wall to get the cell membrane, and then we mash those together, and we get this hybrid protoplast that we can then grow onto a hybrid plant. Now we're going to talk about convergent evolution. So organisms that are isolated but may face similar selection pressures often evolve to have very similar traits, and that's what we call convergent evolution. So if you have similar environmental conditions on different places on Earth, we can still get similar kinds of structures evolving in organism, and therefore they look pretty similar to each other. So similar selection pressures mean that similar traits will be selected for, resulting in organisms that resemble one another. So we could look at examples in terms of streamlining in oceanic creatures. So we have ichthyosaurs, which don't exist anymore, but we have their fossils, so we can get an idea of how they look. And if we look at an ichthyosaur and a shark, they have a pretty similar body plan in terms of things like a dorsal fin, fins on the side. We've got ventral fins as well here to help with control. If we've got dolphins, we can see similar shapes, but there are some differences. So in ichthyosaurs and sharks, the fin goes upwards. In dolphins and all mammals, it goes sideways. And even in penguins, we can see similar structures. So we've got selection pressures which have led to similar looking structures in different organisms due to similar conditions existing over time. So let's say you're a mammal, you have fur, and you're on the ground and you need to be protected. So what kind of evolutionary pressures would you be under, and what kind of structures could you produce that would protect you? And one of those structures are spines and spikes. So here we have echidnas and hedgehogs, and we can see very similar plans in terms of things like using spines as a protective measure. So in echidnas and hedgehogs, we can see these similar structures that have evolved. Now, these organisms would have never met. Hedgehogs are European, whereas echidnas are Australian. So the selection pressures have been similar in different places, and that's led to convergent evolution of similar structures evolving. So many independently evolved structures are also evidence of convergent evolution. Wings are an example of this. So here we have an insect wing, so that's a moth wing. Here we have a bird wing. This would be a dinosaur wing, I believe, and down here we have a bat wing. So we have analogous structures that have evolved just because they're being used for similar things, and nature kind of tends to figure out a way that works. And if that way works well, it's carried on through generations. Divergent evolution is a little bit different. When we get new niches becoming available as a result of succession or change in the environment, different selection pressures may lead to divergent evolution. So this is the gradual accumulation of new characteristics culminating in the formation of new species. So we can look at this in terms of, again, we have an ancestral mammal which has similar structures in an arm, and we can see how those arm structures have changed in different species due to different selection pressures. So we have whales where their arm has turned into a fin, birds where it's turned into a wing, dogs where it's turned into legs and paws, and humans where it's turned into hands. So we had an ancestral mammal species, and over time different selection pressures and different populations of those mammals have led to different structures being produced. So adaptive radiation, it's a particular case of divergent evolution where there's a sudden, in terms of geological time, emergence of new species from a common ancestor. And we talked about Darwin's finches before as a great example of adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation is usually due to a change in the environment of the organism and different selection pressures acting upon them, such as different food sources, predators, and environmental conditions. So let's have a look at those finches again. So with the Darwin's finches, the different Galapagos Islands have different food sources that are available for the finches to use. So those different food sources have led to selection pressures on those finches in order to exploit the foods that are possible. So we get finches produced with mutations, which lead to them having different shaped beaks. If those different shaped beaks are handy for exploiting a particular food source, then we'll get those genes for that beak shape being passed on to new generations. And then when we have more and more mutations accumulating over time, we get to the point where we have completely different species that aren't able to interbreed with each other. So we've got new species being produced. So from a single species, in relatively short geological time frames, we can get new species being produced. And that's adaptive radiation. So let's do our check. Speciation may result from an accumulation of genetic changes influenced by different selection pressures or genetic drift in geographically isolated populations. Describe the process of speciation due to physical separation, which is allopatric, and compare allopatric and sympatric speciation. Similar selection pressures on line-related species may lead to convergent evolution, so recognize and give examples of convergent evolution. And when new niches become available to a species, for example as a result of succession or following environmental change, different selection pressures may lead to divergent evolution or adaptive radiation, and recognize and give examples of adaptive radiation. So today on Flippin Science, we'll look at speciation. That's the Flippin Science today. See ya!